Hi, everyone. So today we wanted to start by acknowledging that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and stolen homelands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As settlers to these lands that were never surrendered or handed over to the settler state through treaty or any other means, we're accountable to Musqueam protocol and law before any other law. But we also want to note that a handling over via treaty doesn't change our accountability to the Musqueam people, and we want to commit ourselves to centering Musqueam sovereignty, Musqueam needs, and Musqueam solutions in all our work and being. And most importantly, we're committed to see that their territory, including lands and waters, are returned or compensated for. The fight for liberation here is a fight that's happening all over the world. As we center Indigenous sovereignty in our work here, we're connected to fighting the same systems that subjugate other oppressed communities worldwide.
We come to this conversation as two disabled people. Like for me personally, my name is Roan, and my own positionalities. I'm a Chinese Indonesian student right now at DBC, and I'm disabled, and I've found like a lot of community support that has changed my life, and I've also worked at a leather manufacturing company when I was younger in Indonesia, so-called third world or like global south countries. So as we talk about climate, the intersection between climate justice and disability justice, this is something that I'd really like to talk about, is how to center both struggles in a good way.
And I'm Anna. I'm a Chinese Tamil settler who grew up in the so-called US. I'm also disabled for context of this conversation. And I feel also connected to this after experiencing a psychiatric hospitalization, where I was shown the value of community care after my discharge, with friends and family around me after being in the psych ward stripped me a lot of that autonomy.
So this recording is the product of an academic seminar focused on the intersections of access and disability and climate justice, because the systems that oppress us is connected, or like the same systems. Our intentions for this recording is to provide an opportunity to learn how climate justice connects to our work, and we can divide it up into like roughly two big sections. The first part, we're going to talk about a brief history of the global north and the global south, and the global south as a manufacturing center, and how the climate crisis affects all of us, and how like this systems of domination, of oppression, has created these conditions, and how I guess like capitalism connects the climate crisis to like the disability justice movements. And the second part roughly is on how we can build cross movement solidarity, how we can advocate for both disability justice and climate justice. Like how can we center like both principles in a society that is almost inherently harmful just because of the way it's structured, and then exploring our own experiences living as disabled people, trying to live the best life possible and with all these limitations. The first part of our recording on the global north and global south brief history. So some of you might be more familiar with these terms, but some people use the global south and third world countries interchangeably. And the thing is, like, there's not always an agreed upon definition. The terms first world, second world, and third world countries originally came from the Cold War to describe the alignment of countries. But post Cold War, this term has just become sort of interchangeable. Some similarities that define the global south or third world countries are usually they are used to mean countries that were ex-colonies or like newly formed nation states, newly independent nation states. They're often described as like quote unquote underdeveloped or developing or poor. And a lot of like these lines of like whether you're the global north or the global south, the lines are drawn based on economic divisions. And a lot of global south nations are manufacturing centers, quote unquote, like places where there's more, again, quote unquote, blue collar work, as opposed to global north, where there's more like office work, where they're like modernized. Um, Also, another thing is that global south or like third world countries are often poorer and exploited by global north countries. And these conditions of like these divisions of global north and global south, or like first world and third world, or like developed versus underdeveloped, is not a natural division. It was created. These conditions are created by capitalism and neocolonialism. The term development itself was invented under the pretense of helping these newly independent nations to modernize or to develop. So this terms like development is relatively new. It arose around the Cold War or like post Cold War era. Um, for this reasons, like for quote unquote helping nations develop, um, global North countries did a lot of things that contributed to the creation of global South countries as poor manufacturing regions. One example is food aid. Food aid has been used historically as a way to displace and destroy a nation's agricultural system because farmers can't compete with free food, right? So as these farmers get displaced and unable to compete like with food aid from subsidized global north farms, they are forced into wage labor. Another thing, for example, that has manufactured these distinctions is uh, the debt trap, which is unregulated lending from both private and non-private banks globally to like global south countries. And so they lend money and with like ridiculous amounts of money, and then suddenly they're like, oops, you gotta pay back. And then because they charged ridiculously high interest rates, and it was hard for global south countries to pay back all at once or like at the rates they were demanded to do it, the World Bank and the IMF, these non-governmental organizations, enforced policies that force global south countries to open up their natural resources and their people to be exploited by mega corporations as a means to get income and to generate income to repay their national debts. So this means that this is kind of like some of the many different factors that go into global south countries becoming super exploited, becoming illegal dumping grounds for like toxic waste, plastic waste, because they're like manufacturing zones, right? And because of the really lax regulations, a lot of people it's very common for people to get injured or like chronically ill again from like, for example, exposure to toxic waste in manufacturing processes and ridiculous overtime work, and the places where people live in, like their communities, their towns, is also getting slowly getting destroyed by these manufacturing processes. The environment is slowly getting destroyed, and like basically all this like so global these processes that make up the global supply chain and that make up uh, the current state of the world, that make up capitalism as it is, like they contribute to the climate crisis, and people of the global south were like already exploited from all these processes. So we know that capitalism on a global scale like fucked us up. It fucked up our climate. It fucked up so many people's lives. Um, you could say like it created disabilities and debilities, especially in this like manufacturing zones because of like lax protections and because like exploitation. Like you just dump everything you don't want to the global south. Like if you've heard about how I think Indonesia, Malaysia, and some Southeast Asian countries are like at the top 5 of like highest plastic polluters, it's because other countries just fucking dump their plastic garbage to the global south. Um, so the comfort and convenience of consumerism that many in the global north experience, like for example, like McDonald's at 2 a.m. or whatever it is built by fucking up indigenous people's lands, including in the global south.
So next, before we start drawing these links, building off of that context, we're going to talk a little bit about disability justice and what it means to live a dignified life as a disabled person. So a lot of disability justice organizers agree that disabled life, dignified life for disabled people is tied to agency and choice in terms of treatments, accommodations, etc. So this could be related to maintaining autonomy when disclosing access needs. A lot of organizers push back against burden of proof or other forced disclosure of medical and personal information to get basic needs met with good reason. So when we first were running this as an academic seminar, we asked people how hyper independent culture in the global north, for example, influences how we think about living with dignity. And someone talked a little bit about how independence slash self sufficiency as success is the paradox of capitalism, or is a paradox of capitalism, uh, which feels like it rings true for me at least, where notions of independence as success really push people away from their own communities. Not something we've observed, especially when we get into the nuanced conversation of access tools that are helpful for disabled people that provide more convenience, how the necessity of these tools in some cases can be built off of the ways medical and carceral systems have stripped people and separated people from their own communities, including uh, basic choices when their body minds are deemed unproductive. So, something that we've been thinking about is how ideas of disability justice practices can be used to help disabled groups and other marginalized groups rely on each other through mutual aid approaches to get the care they need and maintain their autonomy in the process, and how this also connects to uh, less, and how this also connects to a topic we'll discuss next, which includes the connections between disability justice and climate justice.
And how to build cross-movement solidarity. So our next section, we're gonna word vomit on building cross-movement solidarity. This is something that we both me and Anna, we both often talk about. How do we advocate for disability justice and climate justice and harm reduction in a capitalist economy? So, for example, um, we know everyone says like there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but does that mean we can just like do whatever we want? Like, no, I don't think that's what it means. It means that as we learn new things, that means we can um, improve our praxis or our strategy for organizing and our advocacy to achieve a goal that is least harmful and most dignified. So the reason that we started our recording by laying out the history of the creation of the global south and how the global south is like heavily impacted by the climate crisis, but also um, how the notions of independent living that is like like kind of nurtured by capitalism. It's like you got to be independent, you gotta be able to do like things or like have this like fake standard of like functioning. Sometimes leads us to advocate for solutions that will allow us to live like that, which sometimes means tools or things that bring convenience to us, but comes at the expense of other communities if we only rely on, for example, like manufactured inventions. So also like we just want to say that climate justice for us isn't just about addressing the climate crisis and its impacts globally to quote unquote eradicate disabilities that are caused by the crisis. That is like not our goal, but it's just that our organizing takes place in harmful capitalist structures that have also caused disabilities and debilities because of the way that it is structured. So we should take that into account, as we refine our understandings of how these systems work. On the topic of disability dongles and reliance on inventions to live a comfortable life. So, dongles we learned from Liz Jackson are well-intended, elegant yet useless solutions to a problem we never knew we had. And I find that this most commonly is used to refer to inventions created by able people that they think, or maybe like they don't even intended to be used by the disabled community, but ends up sometimes being useful, but most often not. An example of this would be like cyborg arms or cyborg prosthetics. We recently read an article from the community saying that this cyborg hands actually make life harder. And that's like an example of disability dongles. I think like other examples of disability dongles that people are more familiar with is infomercial products. Maybe you've seen it, like fancy egg crackers. Look at this. Like without this egg cracker, I just bought a dozen eggs and they all smash into pieces when I try to crack them. But with this handy little tool, I can crack them perfectly. Which I think, to be fair, like sometimes you really do need these kinds of things because um, sometimes, like they're very useful. Like there are so many infomercial products. I don't know every single one of them, but like once in a while they hit the mark. They actually do what they're meant to do. When people advocate for these solutions, they say, sometimes I want to eat apples at 2 a.m. and like it's not realistic to expect that my friends would be there at 2 a.m. to cut me apples as as an argument of why these inventions are necessary because it allows disabled people to have a comfortable life or like a life where they don't have to quote unquote like beg or depend on other people to have like a minimum standard of like living comfortably. So yeah, we have all these thoughts of like what is a comfortable life? For example, like I'm garbage at cooking. Like my ADHD makes it yeah. My ADHD makes it really hard for me to follow recipes and understand recipes unless they're like super fucking explicit. Cause yeah, I'm just like cooking is not my strong suit. I have like 5 signature dishes and that's it. But anyways, um I would think of this in the sense like, sure, having McDonald's or like skip dishes at 2 a.m. is really handy. And sometimes I do want that comfort, like sometimes I just want to treat myself. Like life fucking sucks.
Yeah, under capitalism, not fun.
Yeah. So having this like having these little things that makes it possible to treat ourselves feels nice. But on kind of like on the opposite side of it is that um these things that allow me to have that comfort to like treat myself and like make me feel good, like at whose expense? Like who has to quote unquote suffer for me to feel good?
Yeah. No, I think that's huge when we were talking about what living a comfortable life means, because it kind of comes down to comfortable for who. And of course, like we like these are tools that we use and we enjoy from time to time, and sometimes more than time to time. So it's more about for us how we're framing it is thinking about harm reduction versus harm deferral. And I actually went to a workshop recently that talked about harm deferral because you hear the term, especially in politics, a lot. You hear the term harm reduction a lot, sometimes a questionable amount. I'm like, is that really harm reduction? Because when, like, especially when people are discussing options and they might say something like the lesser of two evils, if they're both evil, it's kind of not harm reduction. If harm deferral for us means you're deferring the harm onto another community. So one community who may also be marginalized and often is may have like a better like maybe doing a little bit better, but it's at the expense of another community.
Something that, for example, like I think about a lot is how sometimes white people really kind of like, or like maybe white liberals, I don't know, like I'm not great at like political compasses, but basically people glorify Scandinavian countries. They're hailed as an ideal egalitarian and just society. Like the prisons look so nice and everyone has like, I don't know, like really good maternity leave and really great educational support. You don't have to pay tuition or like you get paid to study and stuff like that. They have a really robust social safety net for everyone. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because like that kind of justice or like that kind of like robust social safety net in Scandinavian countries are only made possible because of the exploitation of the global south. So this is kind of like sometimes I think about like what kind of like creature comforts that we take for granted or like that we advocate for that kind of like buys into capitalism, and is there a way that we can kind of like get the same things or like the same feeling of like living a good life, you know, that's um, kind of like thought of in a harm reduction way, because like with the Scandinavian countries I see it as harm deferral because
Yeah.
sure, everyone there lives an amazing life, but the harm is the externalities are passed down to the people we don't see. So yeah, just like thoughts about like, you know, harm reduction versus harm deferral and like um, having to keep learning about existing in under capitalism.
And I think one aspect of this, when we think about capitalism as well as imagining new possibilities for ourselves and thinking of our barriers and limits, is an idea of sacrifice. And a friend in the community, an organizer friend of ours, was talking about some common narratives in our community that discuss non disabled people making quality of life sacrifices for ethical reasons. Lifestyle changes like diet or clothing or not flying or buying habits. Disabled people should be expected to do the same to a reasonable extent. And then there's the other side of that argument that is one, disabled people tend to already make a lot of sacrifices and restrictions around diet and mobility. It's unfair to expect even more than that. And two, individual change isn't effective anyways. We should be campaigning for better alternatives for everyone that actually meet people's needs and therefore aren't regarded as sacrifice. And I think that's where we lie as we're thinking about these concepts together. We discussed a little bit about harm reduction and harm deferral in the past, and I think while it's important to develop that awareness of what choices are ones that are necessary for you and necessary for your livelihood, and for you to operate and organize and just like live in community with others, like what is necessary, but and then acknowledging that the harm by no fault of your own, but by virtue of being in like the system that we're in, how that exists. And so I think with that in mind, like acknowledging the subjugation of global South workers, that is at play, we don't see it as like disabled people should make more sacrifices or be expected to write to corporations and do all of these things. We believe in a diversity of tactics for sure, but I think kind of the object of what we're getting at is that part I mentioned about individual change isn't the most effective anyway. And by campaigning for better alternatives for everyone to actually meet people's needs, that involves a lot of community work and really changing how we see each other and the relationships that we have with each other. These ideas are connected to ones such as transformative justice, where you are not using kind of the punishment based principles of capitalism, but instead thinking outside that. When someone harms you, how do you respond? How does your community help you with accountability, reparations, things of that nature? We believe that in order to center the most effective in the climate crisis, we can use similar principles, including many principles of disability justice that will be linked down in our description as well. How we meet each other's needs, not only as part of our interpersonal relationships, such as mediating conflict with friends and partners and receiving support on that, but also how we think about access needs of individual organizers or individual peoples affected by climate crises and climate injustices, says a lot about our movement and how each of us has a place as a stakeholder in the climate movement.
And we've talked between like just the two of us when we were like planning this seminar. We talk about how this disability dongles and this infomercial products and other things that abled people think disabled people need, or maybe like these products that wasn't originally invented for the use of like disabled people or like elderly people, and we end up using it because it's sort of like fulfill some of our needs, but not really, because they were created by able people. Anyways, we were having this conversation about how these inventions, this disability dongles, this tools, they kind of fit in with society's expectations of like, okay, so this is here. Let me give you what you need to be able to live alone, because honestly, it's hard to build support systems and support networks in a capitalist society. People have to work multiple jobs, and there's just like so many barriers to living a mutually supportive life. And it can be done, but it's just like there's this narrative of resilience and of independence and of the values that is upheld in society. It just is kind of like it works together, so that because we are forced to live under these less than ideal situations.
And I think when you think of ideal community environments for disabled people and other marginalized people, when it comes to healing or organizing, mobilizing together, any of those things, you would hope that people have that sort of relationship, which of course can take time to build. I think one of the ways that this connects back to climate justice organizing for me, and where I see kind of my role in the movement at the moment, is care work and how that feels like a key part of organizing work. And that can also be related to harm that happens in organizing spaces or within community. And someone else in our seminar commented that one of the ways to build interdependence is not prioritizing the work over and instead addressing the harm so it doesn't continue. And I think some other ideas mentioned were apologizing without expectations or forgiveness, forgiving yourself, and learning to voice those needs and rely on others, which feels kind of counterintuitive to a lot of capitalist reasoning in some ways.
But is a theme that keeps coming up in our conversations is that, yeah, like it's great if we can foster and build community and feel good about relying on others, and others can feel good about being able to rely on us as well. On our experiences in climate organizing spaces and other spaces that center disability justice, we had a friend and a community member who's also disabled share this with us. So they said, when I'm also loosely paraphrasing, when I'm organizing, in climate organizing spaces, people always tell me to rest or take a break without any change in how the organizing structures are and what allows or deters people from participating. So it's always like if you're looking tired, which if you live with like chronic pain or like if you live with any kind of chronic condition, sometimes like you're
That
just,
happens.
yeah, it's just kind of your state of being, like
Yeah.
and so it's really not helpful to be just like, oh yeah, just go home and rest. Cause like, well,
Then you would never do anything. Like,
yeah. And it's also not helpful because like in other ways, it's like if you tell us to go home and rest and like never adjust expectations and like workload, that kind of like defeats the purpose.
yeah.
Um,
And that can be counted as access, I don't think.
yeah. So they also said when I'm with disabled community in the disabled community, people ask me instead, what do you need to be able to participate? Do you want to take a break? Or for example, like, do you want to just be present in a meeting without the pressure to engage? Which is a very different approach
Yeah.
to existing. So I think like these are like some really good thoughts about, which is also like applicable to other parts of our lives, not just in organizing spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the key here, and that Rowan has mentioned before in terms of imagining, is how we create access and how we are able to kind of coming full circle to resist some of the like the mindsets or practices of harm deferral is through creating that community and ultimately changing the relationships we have with each other, and relationships that like under colonization and capitalism have been pushed to the side or criminalized in some cases. And so it can be very difficult to like build and maintain community, and it takes a lot of practices that our structures sometimes don't allow for or make very difficult. I'll go back to the one I mentioned before about not prioritizing the work over the harm that is happening, over addressing the harm. That's one that feels kind of difficult for me, even sometimes, like even when harm is happening or even when I'm experiencing harm, there's this like looming pressure, like an internalized ableism applies, but with like the prioritizing of one work and one goal. And I think that can happen in climate organizing spaces too. We have this one goal, our mountaintop goal that we have in mind, and that, and in some spaces, whether it's community or organizing or both, the harm that's happening can feel like a prerequisite or a side effect. And so I think in this next section, we'll get into a bit more about building community and organizing and kind of questioning the individualistic narratives of dignified life. And then, like Rowan mentioned, how can we build those alternative support structures in our lives? And how do we think about the notion of and improving quality of life in general?
Mhm. Yeah, and like we've also like put a lot of thought into how like individual change isn't effective anyway. So like why should we like hyper? Why should we be hypercritical of our individual habits? And just in case that's what you're thinking, that's not what we mean. It's more like as a community, as we like brainstorm, um, and as we work on advocating for what we need, how do we hold all this like different aspects together? Because again, like it's not about policing what someone needs and doesn't need, and it's not about like, oh well, you can live without that. Like
Yeah.
I can't like we totally disabled people are not a monolith. Like someone with like the same condition might have completely different needs to each other.
Yeah.
And so this is not about like being hypercritical of each person or like of your neighbor or whatever. It's like how do we like have these conversations continuously as a community to learn better and be better at like harm reduction and as a group, as a movement, what is it? What kind of solutions or what kind of future are we advocating for? You know, where are we putting our resources into? Where are we putting our limited resources into? People around us. Um, as someone who's like autistic, have ADHD, have been previously honestly at this point I fucking hate like medical diagnosis because it's like so vague, like the things that like so as someone who's like autistic and has ADHD, has been diagnosed with like PTSD, depression, anxiety. I'm just like collecting it at this point. Yeah. So it's just like catch them all. Pokemon. Yeah. I've like I struggle quite a bit with executive functioning. In the past because of like lack of support structures, and I've like come close to being like hospitalized many times when I've like gotten really bad panic attacks or like has just like really bad episodes of dissociation and stuff. And like so far, what has kind of like quote unquote saved me from medication. And I'm not saying that medication is bad. Okay, like some medication is just like bad for me personally with my own experiences, which is why I'm like very I'm just like really scared of being hospitalized because in Indonesia, the default sedation is benzodiazepines. Yeah, and it's just like prescribed so liberally, like it's ridiculous. Like they just give me benzos like for years, like it's just default medication. Yeah. Anyways, so I have gone close to being hospitalized quite a few times, and kind of like the only thing that was like that stopped me from like, I mean, I've been restrained and all that, and they can like chat me with stuff to like calm me down, but like what saved me from actually having to like stay overnight at the hospital for several days was because I had friends who always like couldn't pick me up and was like, my friends know my doctor, so they always managed to convince the doctor, my psychiatrist, to let them take me to their place on suicide watch instead of being hospitalized and sedated. And other support structures that have helped me, like I said, I'm like garbage at cooking. I'm really bad at taking care of myself sometimes. And I have a sibling that I live with in the past few years. Yeah. I'm like amazing at errands, as in like you tell me what to do, and like even if I can't think, I can do. So on my bad days, I don't remember when to eat, or like I'm just really bad at knowing what is going on and what is happening. And for example, I have a sibling who reminds me to eat on eating times, reminds me to drink water, and my sibling loves cooking, so I'm like okay in that sense. And because of this support from my sibling, even when I'm having like bad not functioning days, I've been able to provide support for like my friends by delivering food and getting groceries for them, because like that's like give me instructions and I'll do it kind of thing. Yeah. So it's like this kind of like exchange where yeah, like I'll pick up your medication, I'll pick up your groceries, I'll pick up like, you know, like I'll deliver stuff for you, or like I'll do like more I'll do physical errands if you, for like some friends who are feeling under the weather, and I deliver food that my sibling cooks, because that's something that we have more of. And in exchange, I have friends who help me with like admin stuff, for example. Yeah. Reminding me of, I don't know, school stuff.
Yeah. No. I am one of those people where an access need I can, or an access role I can take on happens to be more admin work stuff. Even when I was struggling and I was I was hospitalized. It was voluntarily, technically. It wasn't because I was kept there, but with kind of my medical background, with depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, all of that fun stuff. When I had made plans with people in medical professionals in my community, the hospital was given to me as like a resource that, like a healing space almost was how it was described. And that was not my experience. Like all the horrible things Roan mentioned that can happen at the hospital, I had kind of seen it happen to other people, and then you are stripped of so much autonomy is the main thing. Like you have no rights there, and people know that. And so I think for me, after I was discharged, I was like, okay, let me seek out my community and make sure that I don't end up back there if possible. And so like, but I think like even when I was in the hospital, like I still could do some admin stuff, but like food for me wasn't happening. So um I have many people in my life who deliver me food, which I'm very grateful of. When we were recording this, Rowan insisted we got food, which was very helpful for me because I don't think I would have eaten otherwise. But there's like so many ways for us and our community that like that we use kind of our experiences to provide for one another, and that feels like the crux of what disability justice and like even transformative justice, where you're divesting from prisons and more punitive structures, including this like word can be. And so it feels nice, and it feels special that we've found that community. And so we're thinking a lot about how to create that for others and how others can create that for themselves.
Yeah, can you imagine like making like skip the dishes obsolete or something like that? It's like, honestly, I would happily like fucking deliver food to my friends like any time of the day. And you know, like I've been like people's sober buddies, and there's just like so many like access roles and access needs are so flexible. And I find like the more that I talk about it with my friends in my community, the more that I can find where it's located among us, you know? And so maybe if I wasn't living with my sibling and I didn't have this many friends, um, I would be a very non-functioning human. I would have to, if I was, well, I had lived alone in the past, and like my reliance on um, takeout for delivery or basically just eating hot dog buns with everything because they're cheap and they don't time to prep. Um, I don't even know where I'm going with this. I'm just saying that like all these things that like maybe uh, like apps or tech or whatever can provide me with, I have found in community support instead.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like what I'm trying to be like, what we're trying to envision is like a more interdependent kind of future where,
Yes.
yeah, yes, yes,
Yeah. We want a more interdependent future, and
yeah,
how like with all our different stakeholders, because we are all stakeholders
yeah,
in the climate crisis and
yeah.
in fighting for a more just future.
Yeah.
Interdependence like can be so valuable in helping us all. Um, how would we think about like kind of honoring disabled community and building those alternative systems? How are we thinking about accessibility in community? So for that particular seminar, we were conducting a 3-hour lecture on Zoom, which is very long or felt long perhaps to some. And so how we navigated that based on like consulting different community members and based off of a handout uh, about building access-centered movements, which we'll link in our transcript. Uh, how we started out the seminar was uh, comparing access needs check-ins versus thinking about it in a communal way. For myself, I've been in like climate justice spaces where you do those access need check-ins, but sometimes based on the dynamics of the session or anything else, it feels hard to actually say what you need, especially if the people running the check-in maybe don't have access needs or are not thinking about them in that way. So to try and think about access needs more communally, we were thinking, how does a certain access need help you fulfill an access role where you can help other people in the group meet their needs as well? And that feels very reminiscent of interdependence, which is a huge part of disability justice.
So yeah, in a meeting where people's power resources are quote unquote more equal, then thinking of like access needs and access goals as like this is a thing we're all working on together. Like we are all stakeholders
Yeah.
here. Like what are my strengths? What access needs do I have? And like what can I contribute? And having that um, discussion, like framing access needs in that way was like much more helpful for us compared to like thinking of access needs as like something that someone has to provide for us.
Yeah, and like a burden almost is how I felt like it in other spaces.
Yeah, because sometimes, yeah, it's really hard to expect the government um, to like be able to like fulfill everything that we need. We know that it's like a really hard climb. So like when we are in our immediate communities where it is possible to um, foster that interdependence, then have like thinking of like access needs in this way where like everyone's a stakeholder. We're all in this
Yeah,
together. We're a community of like,
exactly.
yeah, what can I give and that you need, and what is it that I need that like other people may be better at, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, some examples of that in our seminar were for those who needed more time to process presented information before providing a written and verbal response. Some of those people served as discussion or shareback note takers. They took notes on discussions or recorded responses or stuff that we presented for future reflection, and we had a collective note taking document available. We had people who, when the many chat messages on Zoom come in, are mostly focused on that, record responses from the chat or monitor the chat with raised hands or comments and verbally or through chat notified presenters, and also flag any confusion on activities. We had also um, break leaders, an option for that, for people to use experiences of their own body to note to presenters when a natural break makes sense and lead stretches. And we also had, for those who have experienced feelings of emotional vulnerability in spaces or felt unsafe or undervalued in spaces, which I know is a feeling I felt, we had a safety person to check in with those who might be triggered by content slash expressing distressing thoughts, be an emotional safety contact to check in that others' access needs are being met. So that was kind of an example for our context about how we made this possible.
We all should have conversations on conflicting access needs.
Yeah, conflicting access needs and like conflicting priorities, even of how we come together to engage with disability justice organizing and climate justice organizing, and how like globally to hold these perspectives, and how building interdependence and building community and community trust and accountability and changing how we see our relationships is a huge part of that, is a huge part of our care work and our organizing work. And we invite others to think about um, how aspects of their organizing or their life or community life may be tied to harm deferral. Kind of just reflect on some of those elements. I know I will be after this conversation as well.
Some questions to consider, because again, like we don't want this recording to be prescriptivist. Like everyone has different needs, and harm reduction looks different. Like justice, harm reduction, like all of these nuances look different for each person and for each community. So some questions to consider: build relationships so people feel safe to disclose their needs, or like so you feel safe to disclose your needs to other people. which ties in into what Anna said about
Access intimacy and how you can feel a safety and kind of a comfort in a relationship with someone, knowing that your needs will be respected.
are you proactive in talking about accessibility or providing it? Are you just putting the labor? And this is a question maybe like more directed at like non-disabled people. Is like, are you putting the labor on disabled people to request access? Do you know your community? Do you, when you're holding events and stuff like that, do you plan ahead and making sure you can provide or like facilitate people's access needs and access goals? Because honestly, disability justice should not be an afterthought.
Yes.
Some like easier ones that I think like everyone should already be doing is like, do you have alt text in your shared images? Do you have captioning or subtitles on your audio-visual resources? What does, what does justice look like in your climate organizing campaigns, for example, or like in your disability justice campaigns? What are you campaigning for? What are your talking points? Who is a part of your communities?
Yeah, and I think that especially kind of allows for different kind of levels of engagement that can happen. You can talk about building access and building access intimacy in your immediate community and with your partner, for example. But access is also, in relation to disability justice, can be a huge part of climate organizing or any type of organizing you do. Like Rowan just mentioned, how is that really embedded into the fabric of your work?